So I'm going to be presenting on one experiment in particular that in the course of my master's research, which is on Western Armenian relativization, more specifically than subordination. So as we know, Armenian has a lot of different subordination strategies, and there's a concurrency between two relativization strategies. There's the finite and the non-finite. So the finite strategy, which is similar to English or French, generally starts with like a relative pronoun, and then you have essentially all the makings of a phrase after the complementizer. And then there's the non-finite strategy, which is similar to perhaps Turkish participles. And I'm focusing on Western Armenian specifically, which entails a lot of other problems that I'll get into when I speak about how I found participants. So the basic question here is there a correlation between Western Armenian speakers' preferences for one of these two strategies or the other, and their geographic location or the major language that they're in contact with? Just to review the two relative clauses. So this is what the finite clause looks like. For example, with the invariant vor, and then in this slot, we could also have a WH word, a declined relative pronoun, or also a relative pronoun with a postpositional phrase. And then the pre-nominal non-finite relative clause would look more like this. So this is a similar sentence with basically the same semantic value. So this is the brother who builds houses. And in this position, depending on the context, you could have any of these three participles. So an agentive, resultative, or perspective. There are a lot of names for the participles, and I chose to use these specifically because the other names I feel like can be misleading when you say past participle, or it ties it to a time, a tense, when there's more evidence for an aspect correlation than a tense correlation, with the exception of the perspective participle, the last one. So if you want to see the correspondences between the various names, I did include that in the packet. It's just not in the presentation. So yeah, so the agentive would be or, so shinor, and then resultative would be ads, and perspective would be alik. So the hypothesis that I was testing primarily in this experiment is whether the strategy preferred by a speaker will mirror the languages, or like the dominant language of their surroundings. So we'd assume that speakers in Francophone or Anglophone contexts would tend towards the finite relative, because it looks like a French or an English relative clause. And then speakers in a Turcophone environment or context would gravitate towards the participial. So right off the bat, we have this problem of like, who is an archetypical Western Armenian speaker, when we, unlike Eastern Armenian, we can't go to a specific geographic location and say, these are the native speakers. And so I, in order to work around that, the fact that it is a diasporan language and everybody is necessarily in a multilingual context, I use these three criteria as a partial solution. So if the participant, a lot of times people volunteer like via social media, for example, if they self-report active usage regularly in some domain of their life, and then in talking to them, if they can display and demonstrate productivity with various forms, and spontaneity of conversational spontaneity. So those are the three things that I really used. There was really only one or two people that I had to turn away. I mean, I didn't say that to them, but I had to move their results aside because one of these three, or one of the last two, was clearly lacking. So just to put some theoretical parentheses around that, basically, we could perhaps consider these speakers somewhere on a spectrum between native speaker and a highly proficient semi-speaker, based on Nancy Dorian's definition. So, and then I'm going to walk you through the experiment really quickly. So I met with each participant twice, 2 sessions. In the first session, they filled out a pretty detailed sociolinguistic questionnaire with questions going back to like where their grandparents were from, even, because I thought maybe there would be a correlation there. I'm not going to get too much into that, but then they would do an elicitation experiment one time we'd wait minimum of a week, sometimes more, and then run the elicitation experiment again. And then there were a couple questions about their self-perception of their fluency in Armenian. But at the very end, I didn't want that to be seen before the elicitation. And so in this experiment, each item was presented with 2 slides. The first slide would have the scenario. So here you can see there are 4 brothers, Chorsiak Bayrga, and then I'd present sequentially 4 different conditions. Here, one is a father, one builds houses, one just showered, and one needs to go home. And each of these would appear individually, so that the participant would be able to focus on each one individually. The next slide that they would receive would have these conditions at the top for reference, and then a question, so which brother is this? And they would see 4 images in a slightly different order than the conditions are presented. One of them appears with a red circle, and then they respond which one it is. So in this instance, this is the Dunshino Yechbayr, or the Yechbayr vor Dungashine, so the house builder, if you will. I used 4 animate and 4 inanimate items, or for the nouns within the items. And then because of this interesting situation where the prospective participle correlates pretty directly to tense, but the other ones are more aspect, I decided to use a variety of verb forms to capture a wider breadth of possibilities. And then each item had a noun or adjective control, which I don't think ever resulted in a participial relative, because that's just so unnatural in that instance. So here are 2 examples. These are both animate actually, but so the participant would see these 4 conditions. So one in this instance is present, one is aorist, and one is deontic. And then by country, each participant would receive a different version of the test, of the experiment. So they would have it like in a Latin square format. Basically, they would receive a different stimulus for each question than the person before them in respect to their country. So the results of this is that I got 21 total speakers from 6 countries to participate, all between 18 and 40 years old. So really looking at this generation that is the most distant from speakers from what we might call, Western Armenia. So very much born in this diasporan setting. Almost all of them ran through it twice with the 2 sessions. There was a bigger corpus. I can share that with folks later if they want. Globally, there were no prospective participles in any of their responses, which I found kind of surprising. There's a global tendency towards post-verbal finite clauses, and with one exception, which I'll show in the next slide, and then higher rates of employment of the resultative rather than the agentive, except again in one instance, which I'll show. So 2 slides with the numbers. The most significant things to look at here are that in Lebanon, so these are the countries, UK, Lebanon, Canada, but specifically from Quebec, France, Turkey, and Greece. And Greece, is sort of negligible because it was only 1 participant. So Lebanon is the only one, as we can see here, where there was a higher rate of responses with the participial than the finite clause. And the other one that's interesting to look at is Turkey, because where we would expect to see higher rates of participles, we don't, at least in these data. Hold on. And then just the distribution between the agentive and the resultative, because like I said, the perspective never showed up. In general, responses there were more resultatives than agentives, with the exception of Lebanon. These numbers over here, the both or autocorrection were instances where somebody would use a resultative and then replace it with an agentive, or no, sorry, the opposite, an agentive and then replace it with resultative. And then there were also some other responses, but very minimal, where there were other strategies employed, like an adjective rather than a participial. So ultimately, based on those numbers, the hypothesis that there's this correlation between the dominant language and the choice of relativization it's not fully supported. It's actually refuted in the instance of, say, Turkey, where the preference was for the finite clauses. And so going forward, I have to figure out what some possible explanations are for that. I'm definitely going to take out the elik, the perspective participle, from this equation, because it really seems like it's a very different, beast. There's a little bit of evidence of hypercorrection in hesitations and stuff in the recordings, particularly in the instance of the Armenians from Turkey. And yeah, so I'm going to try some further experiments with accessibility judgments. Thank you for listening.